Hello, and welcome to this week's version of the Conservative Christian Ecology podcast. I'm your host, Justin Allison, and I'll be taking you on about a 20-minute show, which we will talk about environmental issues and also some biblical issues, also regarding the theology of creation in the book of Zechariah. First thing that I wanted to talk about was the event known over the weekend as snowmaggedon, which affected us here in North Texas in a unique way. I actually got to see the biggest snowfall I've ever had at my house ever here last week. We had 12 inches where I live, and that is now the biggest snowfall I've ever seen at my house. The old record for me was back in Oklahoma in the late 80s when I was a kid. But nonetheless, we had a great snow, and there's a picture on my blog of some kids playing in the neighborhood. It was pretty fun. We, of course, living in North Texas here, have like 3 snowplows in our entire county, and so everything was shut down for a couple days. I only took one meteorology course in college, and that was a decade ago, but somehow my suspicion that weather prediction is imprecise came true today. As of Wednesday afternoon, the weathermen were saying that we might get some accumulation, possibly an inch or so. And then about 11:30 p.m. they changed their mind and said we would get about 3 inches in accumulation of snow, mainly in the afternoon on Thursday. But it snowed from the early hours a.m. when, that is Thursday morning, started snowing late Wednesday night, early Thursday morning, into the late hours p.m. Thursday night, and it snowed continually. All told, it was a record snowfall for North Texas. I think we all told, after it had stopped snowing and there had been a little rain and things, we still had eight deep inches in my yard. And I averaged that, because I just have to take different samples and average things. That's how I think. But anyway, as a Christian who cares about God's creation or the environment, events like today give me pause. So did the fact that the Weather Channel made the comment that this was the most snow during a winter since the 78-79 winter. I found that statement intriguing, since at that point scientists were concerned with global cooling. Now, some people will claim that events like today are evidence that disproves global warming. But at the same time, there will be plenty of those who claim that snow of that magnitude in the winter proves that there is no such thing as global warming. And they will say that in their minds settles the debate. Either way, I think it's hard to make a judgment call on that one. But I think it just goes to show that here in North Texas, every 30 years or so, we're going to have a really snowy winter. I think this is evidence that forecasting does not have nearly accurate enough models to predict the weather with any degree of certainty, let alone the weather in a few decades. Now, as a critique of that, a friend of mine, John, who has a background in mathematics and computer programming, computer science, he would be the person to know about these sort of things. He says, be careful. Short-term weather forecasting vastly differs from long-term climate prediction. And acknowledging that he probably was the guy to talk to about this, he responded back and said, you mentioned a good example, that is seasons. He said, I can predict on average the U.S. will be colder in winter than in summer, but I have no idea what particular forecast in a particular place will be. Over longer scales, patterns emerge and can be tracked. The stock market is a similar example. He says no one can predict what stocks will go up or what stocks will go down on a particular day. over such a short time, but historical trends show that even with depressions and recessions, the aggregate movement is upwards. I'm not sure that's the case in light of the last 18 months of the stock market, but we'll give him benefit of the doubt there. Climate prediction is looking at much longer trends than weather forecasts, and therefore small fluctuations like the current Texas cold snap are smoothed out. I just want to point out something here, that anytime you're looking at a segment in time, if you adjust the segment of time, you can make it say different things. For instance, if one were to look at a segment of 2 decades, including the Great Depression of the stock market, you'd get a vastly different example than you would if you started looking at data following the Great Depression, say 1933 through 1999. You would get a completely different view of the stock market than you would if you looked at the data from, say, 1929 up to 2009. Yeah, the end of 2009. You're going to see a totally different story there, and that's only moving your boundaries just a decade on each end there, and you're going to get a totally different picture. Similarly, I think that if you look at climate over a long enough amount of time, you're going to notice that trends go all over the place. There was, I believe, one of the scientists from the IPCC, who I think was actually backed into a corner by the interviewer, but he nonetheless answered a question in a way that to the effect said that he admitted it was possible that it would have been warmer on average in the Middle Ages than it is nowadays, which they were trying to get him to say as a way of disproving climate change. But once again, I think it just goes to show that it depends on what segment of time you're looking at. And then you're always looking at the question of, well, how much is enough to really get an accurate data set of something that can really take into account all the variables. Getting back to what John said, he said weather forecasts are extremely difficult to predict because, as you mentioned, there's so many variables that affect it. The key to longer-term prediction, though, is making sure you have enough data points to see trends, which is kind of what I was talking about. And as an example of bad predictions where my data doesn't take into account longer trend cycles, I can predict that based on current trends of today's weather. At the time of writing, he said it was 8 a.m., that this afternoon will be very hot and bright. Every hour since midnight has been getting hotter and brighter, so that obviously tells me that tonight will be warm and tomorrow will be unbearable. Unfortunately for my predictions, my data model does not see the long-term trends of a day-night cycle. Climate models are complicated and require good data to make accurate predictions. Do we have enough data to see long-term trends and strongly correlating variables? He says, I'm not a climate scientist, I don't know. However, realizing that I'm not an expert, I'll defer to them. I have no reason to doubt what they say. Good points made by my friend John. He's a very, very bright person, as I'm sure you can tell by his comments. The second thing I want to talk about is a couple of things by way of mentioning that to me are more fun than they are really even relevant for anything. The first one is something that was listed over at the website Boing Boing, which I'd never heard of before. It didn't look that great to me, but nonetheless, they had a story about what they called a compost-heated tea room. Actually, they called it a poo-heated tea room. To be sure, there wouldn't be much, if any, poo in compost, but I think they were going for shock value. I think it's worth checking it out and just looking at the silly comments that people made about it. The thing looks kind of goofy, but the idea seems to maybe have some merit.